Så er vi nået til den første taler, Suzanne Hansen. Hun kommer fra New Zealand hele vejen. Hun har 40 års erfaring med UFO Research. Hun er leder af stifter af noget, der hedder UFO Focus New Zealand Research Network, som er en organisation, som indsamler, analyserer og studerer UFO-rapporter i New Zealand. Den vurderer også, om UFO'er udgør en sikkerhedsmæssig risiko for flytrafikken. Derudover har den også som mission at vurdere, om der er en sammenhæng mellem UFO-aktivitet og vulkansk og seismisk aktivitet. Hun har rejst i mange lande og givet foredrag, og her i Danmark er det vist første gang. Is it the first time in Copenhagen giving a lecture? Good. Welcome to you, Suzanne Hansen. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you need this one. Thanks.
Okay, kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, which is Māori, New Zealand Māori language for hello and greetings to you all. I've had the flu the last few days, so I'm struggling a bit to keep my voice going. Today I'd like to dedicate my speech to my friend and colleague Graham Opie, who worked with me in Ufocus NZ for 20 years and very sadly passed away about 2 weeks ago. Graham was an air traffic controller and pilot who stepped out of his profession, shall we say, to investigate UFO sightings in New Zealand with me and the rest of the staff at Ufocus NZ. Today I'm going to talk to you about the book that I have just written a few months back. It was completed. It's called The Dual Soul Connection, The Alien Agenda for Human Advancement. And the book I wrote in conjunction with a US astrophysicist from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, Dr. Rudy Schild. And today I'm going to look at some of the contents of that book and my experiences of contact and the new physics, or what Dr. Schild calls the quantum alien technology that's involved in some of those experiences. So that will involve telepathy, consciousness, and descriptions of alien technology. This is Dr. Rudy Schild. He's an emeritus astrophysicist, just retired recently, and he has worked in the UFO field in the States for quite a few years and is quite well known because he's an open-minded astrophysicist who studies cosmology, and he's very keen to talk to experiencers who can give descriptions of alien technology, particularly that which involves the use of consciousness to operate it. That's the cover of my book, which is available for purchase at this conference, and I'm going to be discussing aspects of the book as we go along. So the descriptions I'm going to give today will involve a number of entities, and these are just some examples of drawings of some of the kinds of entities that I have had contact with. Now, I have a foot in both camps in that for 40 years in New Zealand I have investigated UFO sightings, and I mean going out into the countryside, wherever sightings have occurred, taking photos, collecting evidence or whatever, interviewing witnesses, but also at the same time I have had my own experiences from early childhood. In New Zealand, I'm better known for talking about the New Zealand UFO sightings. Overseas, I tend to talk about my experiences. In New Zealand, it's still quite closed in that a lot of people are happy to hear about sightings, but they're not quite so happy to hear about contact experiences. So in my book, I describe the greys, which is the top left and bottom right, mantis entities, which a lot of experiencers talk about. And then top right, you've got very human-looking beings that some people call them the Nordics. I don't. They just seemed like advanced human beings to me. My experiences began in childhood, and I used to wake up at night and I would see these golden glowing figures by my bed. They were always in a group of 3. And that's quite significant. A lot of experiencers talk about seeing entities in groups of 3, entering their home, coming through walls, etc. And so I would wake and there would be these golden beings in the room. They would speak to me, but when I say speak, their mouths never moved. I didn't see their facial features, so it was as if they were talking to my mind. But as a child, of course, I didn't know about telepathy and what it meant. But that's how they communicated with me. They would generally say they were taking me somewhere, and then I'd remember no more. It was as if everything went black, there was this missing period of time, and then they would say to me, I'd find myself back in bed or getting into bed. They would tell me that they were very pleased with what had taken place, but I didn't know what had taken place, and they'd instruct me to turn over and go to sleep, which I would. However, in childhood I had a lot of dreams, very vivid, lucid dreams of having been places in large, white, expansive rooms, stark environments, with a group of 3 that I couldn't see properly. So here's this protection mechanism going on where, as a child, in that conscious state, they didn't really allow me to see them. But it wasn't until later on that I had recollection of what they looked like and what took place. For me, a defining moment was when I had an extraordinary experience in a place called Hawke's Bay in New Zealand. And this was in 1975 when I was 20 years old. My flatmate and I had been travelling from a rural sheep farming area to the city where we lived. We'd been down to the farm for the day, each on a different farm, and he picked me up in the late afternoon to take me back with him back to the city. Now, it was autumn and it was a lovely sunny afternoon, golden sunshine, and as we came down out of a series of hills, we could see a long 2.5 kilometre straight ahead of us down below. And as we wound down out of the hills towards that straight, we saw lights, 2 white lights appear over the hills along to our left. We assumed it was a helicopter, perhaps an agricultural aircraft going to land at a farm for the night. And so we didn't take too much notice until the lights clicked out and appeared instantaneously closer to us. So we still were trying to convince ourselves it was a fast-moving helicopter or an aircraft or another aircraft that had turned up. And so we looked for the rational answer of what was causing these lights to click on and click off. Eventually, after a few seconds, they clicked off again, and they appeared closer to us, right beside us over the hill. We started to get quite afraid then, and by this time we'd got down to the bottom where this long straight was. We'd come to a stop to look at the lights. They clicked out again. We looked around and couldn't see them reappear, so we thought, oh, well, we have no explanation for that, let's carry on. And as we began to drive off, my flatmate said, oh my God, it's coming up behind us. And a huge orb of light wider than the road, about 30 feet in the air, came over the top of our car. It filled the car with the brightest possible light, and it was accompanied by a loud, grinding, buzzing sound that went right through your body. And the last thing I recall was feeling the car lift off the road. And then I tried to turn my head before kind of passing out, and I saw my flatmate. His hands had dropped off the steering wheel. He was no longer driving. The car began lifting off the road, and I don't remember anything else. About some time later, which turned out to be an hour and a half later, it was as if I suddenly woke up and I didn't know where I was. My long hair was blowing all around my head. The window was open. The car seemed to be floating. You could feel this floating movement. Then it hit the road, the lights came on, and we realised we were now at the far end of the straight, and it was pitch black. When we got back to our flat in the city, our flatmates said to us, "You're late." We worked out we're an hour and a half late. We don't know what happened, and it was a terrifying experience at that stage. But that experience catapulted me into both sighting investigation in New Zealand. I began interviewing people who'd had sighting experiences, and it also catapulted me into the whole contact arena, because I began seeking answers as to what had happened and what was going on. Because at that time in New Zealand, we knew very little about the contact thing. That really didn't arise until several years later, and so it was a very confusing situation to find myself in. Okay, so we're going to have a look at some of the experiences that I have had. I want to make the note at this point that most of my memories are conscious memory. That means I wake up in the morning and I know exactly what happened during the night. I have distinct memory of many of the experiences. Some of them I have entire memory of the experience. Others I remember the beginning and the end, or a piece in the middle, or several pieces in the middle. And it wasn't until after 20 years that a researcher in Australia encouraged me to have regression. Now, I resisted that for 20 years because there was a lot of controversy going on worldwide about how accurate regression was. But I have found that for me, when I eventually had regression to fill in the gaps, it was very, very useful and very helpful. So the book itself talks about my conscious experiences, but I have also blended in some of the extra details that came out under regression. And I have old videos and DVDs of me speaking many, many years ago, describing these experiences before I ever had regression on them. So nobody can say they all came out of regression because I have that evidence. On this occasion, I was taken on a craft with a lot of other humans. It was a grey craft, manned by the grey species. And during the course of discussions that were taking place, I expressed an interest in space. And one of them said to me, "Come and I'll show you something." And we went up a spiral gangway up to what I assume was inside the top of the craft. And we entered a room that was obviously square, but seemed to have a circular spatial aspect to it. And very often in the rooms on a craft, there is something, you find there's something peculiar about the space of the room. Sometimes they seem to be able to expand it, and many experiencers talk about going into a small room which then expanded. Going into a small craft, and then when you got inside, it seemed to be massive. And this is something that Dr. Schild and I have been looking at other reports from experiencers that are similar. So in this room, there seemed to be this rounded quality that I couldn't work out, rather like looking into a fishbowl. But in the centre of the room was that dark grid on a screen that was standing on a pedestal. Now you can see there that it's divided into hundreds and hundreds of little squares, like a mathematical grid. And on it there was the image of what he said was our Milky Way, was our galaxy. And then when he touched certain screens and things on the screen, up would come what I now know is the virtual reality. So in the air in this room would come up a planet, a sun, or whatever. So whatever grid he touched on that screen, up would come something from that portion of the grid. So he could then zoom in and zoom out, make them huge, make them tiny, show them in relation to other moons or whatever else, solar systems that were around them. So back in 1978 to 1983, this experience occurred somewhere in those years. I didn't document at the time what year it was, but it's in that time period. And of course, we knew nothing about virtual reality. So when I initially described these things way back, I talked about things hanging in the air like big beach balls, like big soccer balls, because I didn't have the modern technological language to describe it that we now have of virtual reality. So here's a quote from the book. "We stood within a hologram," because I now know that's what it was, a virtual reality hologram, which formed a giant sphere almost entirely encompassing the interior of the room, filling it with planetary bodies from this grid of the galaxy. Now he could also go forwards and backwards in time. So he told me he could show me things in real time, which today we find that very difficult to understand, because what we see in outer space has already happened a very long time ago, before the image of it travels to us, if I can put it that way. So much of what I was told in this particular experience, I'm still going through with Dr. Schild, the astrophysicist, and looking at the details of it. Now, he talked about a time in our history back just after during and after the war that changed life on our planet, and that was the atomic explosion when they dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he showed me the Earth and the image. He adjusted this technology so that when this explosion took place in this real time of that time period, in this hologram, he was able to show how these shock waves went out through the electromagnetic field of our planet, which is depicted by that pink shimmering line, went right out into the solar system, and he kept pulling the image back, so the Earth got smaller, so you could see how far out that shock wave was going, right out into space. So this told me at this point in time that whatever we do on our planet that's destructive and explosive affects everything, all life around us. And we are only just beginning to realise that there is life around us. So he's showing me the Earth's magnetic field and it's exploding outwards. I can see the effect of the explosion reverberating right out through the solar system and further out into the galaxy. Now, 70 years have passed since the bombings, and what has changed? We are still looking at nuclear armament. We are still looking at, there's the potential of nuclear war. So in the top right-hand image, you can see Hiroshima before and the bottom Hiroshima center after. And he said to me, time could stop for you if we continue down this path. There will be nothing left of you on the grid. So he's talking about that screen and our position on the grid in the galaxy. There could be nothing left of us. Now, my good friend Robert Silas, who some of you may know, an American whistleblower, military whistleblower, has written a book, Unidentified, the UFO Phenomenon. And it's a very good book about his experience of a UFO coming over an American Malmstrom Air Force Base, where he was working as a young man and shutting down all the nuclear missiles when they were doing their test run, bringing them up, testing all the systems. They shut them down for 2 days, they shut down all the computers, and they had to scramble to get them up again. They also went to a nearby base and did the same in the late 60s. So this whole issue of nuclear armament is of concern to those who are outside of our planet, and they understand the danger that may face us. And Robert says, if each of us commits to the idea of the complete and total abolition of nuclear weapons, together we will have prevented nuclear war. And together we will have actually prevented our annihilation. Now, just digressing here, I'm just going to shift away from this particular incident and go back to what I mentioned about the dimensions of rooms changing. So I'm just going to slip a little bit of information about another experience in here that illustrates the same kind of technology. I was taken to a room with a group of humans on one occasion, and we went into a very small white room, and we were told that we were going to link into pure thought, pure energy. And we were warned that the dimensions of the room would change. So we stood in the middle of it, and it was as if we saw the walls on all sides moving apart and receding until we were now standing in a very vast space, a vast white space. And on this occasion, the greys, the entities with us, illustrated how they can use this consciousness, that they connect to the craft and they connect to a communal consciousness, and their bodies actually began to disintegrate into a shower of bright light. And since writing the book, I've made contact with an experiencer in the States who worked with the late Dr. John Mack, and his name is Carlos. And he's now in his 70s, but he has had a similar, almost identical experience to me. So this is where it's very important that experiencers find this corroborative evidence. They find other people worldwide who've had a very identical and very specific experience or can describe a specific piece of technology, because it would be difficult for people in different places to imagine something so specific. So he described the floor as resembling a dance floor composed of dense matter. It was not solid, but I could stand on it, feeling that I was standing on open space beneath me. And I described a vast room, an expanded space, a feeling as if I was floating. So there again, you're standing on something, but it doesn't quite seem solid, as if suspended in midair, although I could feel the soft floor. So we have this very similar description going on of the room getting bigger, the entities disintegrating into a shower of colour, and the floor feeling as if you're not actually standing on something and you're suspended. So I just thought I'd slip that in there. Okay, we're moving on now to an experience where, believe it or not, I was in a small scout craft being taught how to fly it, and many experiencers have gone through this process. And I was told we were going to pass through the planet. Now that, for me at that time, I was quite terrified immediately of what would happen. So let's walk our way through it. I was taken onto a craft that had, there were 5 entities on it to start with. And I was taken on board at night, and I was told that I was going to be given instruction on how to fly a small scout craft. The small craft that are often seen in our atmosphere, the ones that are often described as having this wobbling, falling leaf motion when they are hovering. And I was told that this was not a special thing, it was just that they do this occasionally. They take humans and get them to use different technology and using consciousness to test them out and see how well we can operate their technology. And this leads on to the fact that a lot of technology is appearing in our world now that many experiencers have seen similar, more advanced versions of on craft. So are we being fed technology? Have we downloaded it from downed craft? I don't know. So on this occasion, they opened up a screen eventually after we had travelled for some reasonably short time, and it was now daylight, which told me that I had been taken to the northern hemisphere. And there was a hillside covered with bright orange autumn leaves, which was a different season from where I was in New Zealand, and we don't have that kind of vista in New Zealand with large areas of autumn leaves like that. So I knew I was somewhere very different. And in my right hand you can see I'm holding and operating a lever there which flipped up out of the floor. And I was told I would be taught to operate the craft using a manual method, so using that stick rather like a glider stick, but much smaller and more sensitive. And I would also be taught to operate the craft simply by thought, by power of intent. So this went on for some time, and I learnt the 2 processes, and I actually found that the telepathic or the mind control of the craft connecting to the craft's consciousness was much easier because it bypasses all the brain messages that have to go to ligaments, muscles, tendons, etc. before you even make a movement. That has to take place. So the telepathic one of connecting directly to the craft and giving an instruction of intent, move forward so many whatever, is actually easier. Behind me there were 2 Nordic-looking entities. These particular entities work with the greys, and so I was taken to a grey craft first, and then I was put on a smaller craft with these entities here. So when I hear people say, the greys are bad, these ones are good, these ones don't work with these ones, I don't go along with that because I have seen a whole variety of species on the one craft working together, and they're working together for our advancement and betterment, even though the majority of us don't realise that. So at the end of this flight instruction period, they said to me that they were going to take me home through the planet. Now, as you can imagine, your mind immediately fills with incineration and, how could that possibly happen going through matter? But as Dr. Schild has explained, it's no different from, it's the same principle as experiencers who talk about being taken through a door, through a wall, through a window with these entities. This is the same principle of the atoms, and the phase of the atoms is changed and altered in a split second, so you can pass through matter and come out the other side. So to begin this trip, they first went out quite some distance so that you could see the curvature of the planet. And I describe it in the book as first landform and then ocean and cloud banks receded into the distance. A breathtakingly beautiful vista of planet Earth, such as I will never forget, filled the window screen. A change in the status of the craft and everything in it would take place. There would be a shift, a temporary phase of movement from one place to another. In that altered reality, in effect, we would pass through the planet from point A to point B. Then we began to move in closer to the planet, and as we did so, on the screen in the wall, I could see the spiralling effect happening. The landmass came closer again, but within a few seconds, the view transformed, spiralling clockwise into a cone-like form. And Dr. Schultz says, as I said a minute ago, the description of flying through the planet is fascinating. In my view, this involves the same manipulation of the phase information of the material as walking through walls, windows, and doors. We plunged into darkness, so the interior of the craft went dark. On the screen, there were just static lines of colours going up and down, and this was accompanied by a soft but high-pitched humming, whining sound, and I dared not move. And Dr. Schultz says, Susie's description that flying through the Earth's interior produced images of a dark tunnel-like cone or vortex on the window screen suggests again a process dominated by spiralling waves related to consciousness. So everything to do with this experience, the instruction of the craft, the change of its form, and its status is to do with consciousness. Okay, we're going to go to an interesting one now. I've divided this experience, which is called the test, into part 1 and part 2, because I completely remembered all of this experience in great detail and documented it and talked about it many years ago. It happened in 1993, and I'd like to make the point that in 1993, I didn't have a computer. I'd never used a computer. We didn't have them in New Zealand. We had them in institutions like perhaps hospitals or universities, but the general public didn't get computers until 1995, and I personally did not use a computer until 1998, and that was only to use Word. I didn't know anything about the internet at all. But what I'm going to describe in this experience, you will all begin to recognise some of the things that are in this experience that have come out in our own technology in the world in recent years. So at the time, I could only describe it in simple layman's terms. So 16 humans were taken into a room for a test situation. Now that each of us was going to be given a different test or task to complete. They were all of the same complexity. One wasn't easier than the other, but we would all use different material and different data to solve this problem. However, it was not actually solving the problem itself that was the important part of this test. It was how we went about solving it. So the test in terms of these entities watching us was how well we used their equipment, how well we were able to use some of the skills they had taught us, some of the mind skills, telepathic skills, etc. That was actually the test that they were looking at, how we reached that answer and what we used to get there. So there were two, what I call elders or ancient greys up the front. You can see one's got a cone-shaped head, the other has a more bulbous head, and they were in charge of this procedure. So first of all, we were each assigned a small grey who would assist us throughout this. And what was going to take place was they would convey a great deal of information from their mind straight into ours. And we would be able to use this data to assist us to solve this problem. But when I say putting information into our mind, I'm talking about the equivalent of dozens and dozens of encyclopedias of information, put into the human mind in a short period of time, about 1.5 minutes it took. So all we had to do was simply sit there, you would feel a tingling in your forehead, and they would telepathically plant that information in your mind. Now the symbol that you can see on the screen there behind us, that it was my personal symbol. Each human had their own symbol which contained all the information about them. So it's like your pedigree, it's like all the information about your physical body, your psychological body, your experiences, everything about you. Now the next thing he showed me, and this is where you will start to recognise some things, each of us was given a small tablet, an information tablet. Now remember, this was 1993. However, it was very, very thin, like a sheet, slightly thicker than a sheet of paper. It was rather like the old-fashioned X-ray sheets where you go to the hospital, have an X-ray, and they give you a grey-coloured plasticky sheet. Rather like that, very thin. And no visible power source, very flexible. What I now know were 3D images, because I described them as saying the images stood out from the tablet, they stood up from the tablet, they radiated into the air so that it was 3D. And each one was individualised and had data on it for each individual. And it was a touch screen. You can see my box contained like some maps, some script, and some planets with electromagnetic fields around them. And I had to work out how to get from one planet to the next, without damaging those electromagnetic fields between them. So looking at moving with the flow of energy in space in this little system rather than cutting through it. That was my task. We put the tablets into the console of the larger computer and it came up bigger on screen. So once again, this tablet was also being used like a USB or a memory stick put into the larger computer. And we were able to bring the images up and we could flip them on the screen, just as we do today, but this was 1993. We could enlarge them, reduce them, all the things we can now do, remembering at this time I'd never used a computer or even seen one on this plane. And if you have a look there coming out from my face there, I could also bring up, using my mind, and don't ask me how this can be done, but on the craft where there is a different state of consciousness and an elevated awareness, elevated telepathic ability, you're able to bring something up and hologram it out of your mind in front of you, look at it and flip it away. And while I was sitting there working on this, the grey next to me, who had been partnered with me, was giving me some information, not cheating, not giving me help, but just giving me added information. And there Dr. Schultz says that he suspected the technology was 3D, involving a deeper quantum development of computer much closer to consciousness itself, and at that time was a giant leap for our civilization and still is in terms of 3D technology. Now what the Grey talked to me about while I was busy working on this was what he called rivers through space. And that is, they have an awareness of these massive flows of energy. And Dr. Schild is doing a lot of work on this dark energy and black holes. And so they're aware of these flows and they utilize those flows. They don't always go through space at lightning speed as we would assume. They often use these flows so that they are not disturbing other civilizations or life on other planets. And they are able to move from one flow to another. We are just beginning to understand that these flows exist. So he talked about how when they come into our atmosphere, they also use those same flows within our atmosphere. So it's a combination of where there are particular energies being emitted from the Earth. And we all know that there are places on our planet that have these strange energies. Sometimes it's to do with the tectonic plates. And there are weather patterns. There are flows of weather patterns around our planet, and they utilise all of this information to travel within our atmosphere so that they're not cutting straight through and creating damage to the flow. And he talked about how this damage can actually damage our nervous systems and our well-being. He commented that thousands of aircraft traverse our skies daily, and we will eventually understand the harm this disturbance to natural energy fields is causing to life on Earth, affecting our health and nervous systems, as well as the pollution caused by fuel consumption. And just before I came over here to England and Denmark to speak, in my local newspaper I found this, which really corroborates what he said back in 1993. And this is a photograph taken by NASA of a supersonic aircraft travelling over the Mojave Desert in the States. And using special photography, that high-speed photography that can capture the shock waves from the supersonic aircraft, you can see the shock waves coming out from it, blasting out from it. And modern high-speed cameras can now pick up shock waves from explosions and show it visually on the screen. You can see it booming out, wave after wave going out. And this is what the Gray was talking about, the damage that's being done. And it's interesting to note that exactly what he said we would eventually understand and begin to do is happening. And that is NASA is now looking to develop supersonic aircraft that are quieter and don't create such a havoc to our atmosphere, so that they can be used to come in over cities, land at airports, etc. At the moment, they're limited in where they can fly over heavily populated areas. So it's just a little bit of corroborative evidence. Now, one of the boxes on my screen showed some script. Now, a lot of experiencers and abductees talk about this strange script that they see on craft, and some people say they can read it and understand it. There seems to be what I call a bridging script that's like a combination of the alien script and some of our own written languages that is easier for humans to understand and recognise. But the script that I have used on craft is what I call has a consciousness to it. So if you, for example, took that bottom one there, if that was an icon on a computer, you'd click on that and up would come a web page or something. So you could access that data by clicking and going deeper. Well, the script on the craft is very similar to that, and I have to wonder if this is where we got a lot of our ideas of the internet from. Because when you look at that, you would look at it and your state of consciousness would allow you to go down and into that script. And all of this information, if you're connected to the consciousness of the craft, will come pouring into your mind. So there's no need to touch it, there's no need to click on it or anything like that. You simply focus on it, and in your mind, everything associated with that symbol will open up, and in your mind, you can go through it. Now that sounds phenomenal, but it is really, if we think about it, possibly the next step for us from tapping on an icon and bringing up a web page. We will learn to telepathically, eventually, just go into that box or that script symbol, and out will come the information into our mind. And I describe that in my book. I talk quite a bit about the script and this depth reading, what I call depth reading of the script. You can't read the surface of it. And people say to me, well, what does that mean? Well, I don't know what it means. I can't read it like I could read a book. I would have to be on the craft, connected to the consciousness, and then I could look at it and tell you what it meant. Okay, now a friend of mine in the States who's actually a military person, and he's also had some experiences, he said that in 1974 he woke up, he was semi-awake at the time, and he thinks either in his mind's eye, he's not sure now, or whether it seemed like a hologram in front of him, he saw an array of technical symbols and equations passing before his eyes. It was a long array that passed too quickly for him to focus on any one thing, but he felt it represented the vast makeup of something simple and familiar. And the whole impression he gained from this very brief experience was that he was being shown and taught something to do with data. So it represented the vast makeup of something simple and familiar. And he said to me, like a cheese sandwich. So a data description of a cheese sandwich. And this is a situation we're getting to on our planet now where we have data overload. If we look at the data description of a cheese sandwich, we can go into the bread. We can look at all the ingredients. We'll have data on each one of those ingredients. For example, the wheat. Where did the wheat come from? What kind of soil was it grown in? What was it, the soil's chemical makeup? Where was it? How was the wheat harvested? Who harvested it? Where was it ground, etc. We could go into the cheese. Where did the milk come from? What factory? What herd did it come from? What kind of herd was it? What was their physiological makeup? What was their genetic makeup, etc. We could go into the psychological side of it. Who made the sandwich? Why did they make the sandwich? What sort of person are they? What is their health like? Where do they live? We could just broaden out a huge amount of data about a cheese sandwich. And that's a situation we're getting to now with data overload. We now have the internet, we have cloud computing, we have all of this data, and students and researchers and people who want to find out about something are finding it harder and harder because there's so much data. Which do you go to first? How do you go to it? And this is where in the future this whole consciousness, telepathic, intuitive thing will come into play, just as they do on the craft. And the interesting thing is that with this data overload in the States, they have recently started at Phoenix University teaching students cognitive learning and perceptual learning and intuitive learning. So they are given a great amount of data and they just look at it. They're being taught to look at it the same way as I was taught to look at the script and know which one I want to go into. They look at the data and intuitively, they read down the middle of it, they just scan it, and they get a feel for whether that might be useful for them or not. So isn't that interesting that even now we are beginning to move towards these new ways of looking at data? And this university is looking at how are we going to express the data? Should we take this piece of data and give it a symbol? Should we give it a shape? Should we hang it upside down? How do we depict data so that every piece of data is somehow a little different? So here's this whole perceptual, intuitive learning beginning in our civilization that takes place on the craft. When on the craft you are scanning vast amounts of information, you get a feel for what you need and the rest you discard. Okay, in the second part of this test, so we've completed this test that I talked about. There were 16 humans, 4 of us passed the test, including myself, and I was given the pile of those paper-thin tablets, information tablets or mini computers. It's very similar in size to the tablets we have today, but much thinner and advanced. And I was told I could take it down to the next floor of the craft. Now, if you have a look at that image there, you'll see this tubular object here going up through the ceiling with an opening that opens up that you step out of. I'm just stepping out of it. And as you can see there, it has the appearance of water. So I nicknamed this a light elevator, and I described it as being like liquid light. And it functioned through consciousness and telepathy. You stepped into it. There was no floor. It was just a contained column of bright, sparkling blue-white light. You stepped into it. You thought a symbol of the level you wanted to go to. There was a moment of blackness, and then you found yourself on another level. A perspex-like door slid open, and you stepped out. Now, for quite some time, I kept this particular experience quiet because it seemed too far out there. It seemed too strange. It seemed, it wasn't like any technology that I could align with on our planet. And it seemed just beyond the realm of normal. However, in 2006, when I was preparing to speak in Australia, I decided to scan the internet and see what drawings I could find that other experiencers had drawn that might be similar to something I have seen. And bingo, that's what I found. I found an image by an experiencer called Jeff, and he described it as liquid light. That was the name of the image on the website. So I contacted him through the website and said, look, I have seen something very similar to this, but I don't want to give you any information. I want you to tell me what this was that you drew. Was it a real experience? Did you imagine this? Is it something you've drawn from your own experience? And he came back and said yes. He has worked with MUFON in the States for quite a few years, drawing images for experiencers. He's an artist. This was of his own experience that happened in 1995, which is 2 years after my experience. He described this as a light elevator, the same as me, a tubular thing that would go right between areas of the craft. You stepped into it, you thought your way to the next stop. It felt like velvet on the skin, which is exactly the description that I used. So here was, for the first time for me, real corroborative evidence of something that I had seen. Very tangible corroborative evidence of something very specific that has a function. So I get to Australia and I spoke at a number of meetings, and at one of them a young girl came up to me with her mother afterwards and said, I want to show you some drawings of my experiences. And this image was one of them, and I said to her, well, what's that? Tell me about that. She said, well, it's a kind of teleporter, a tubular column of bright, soft, sparkling light that transports you elsewhere. So again, we have another experiencer in a different country who's travelled in the same elevator, can describe it in the same way, soft light, touches your skin like velvet. And so now I had the three, my own and theirs as well. The light elevator is almost certainly an anti-gravity device involving magnetoelectric influence on gravity, and the device was under thought control in interaction with the conscious intent of the enveloped sentient beings. This is a comment made by Dr. Schultz, who contributed footnotes, commentary, and a scientist's epilogue to my book, examining all the scientific aspects of it that fall within his area of expertise. And since that time, and during the time of writing the book, I've had a number of other scientists in different fields who've reviewed the book, talked to me about the information, and have been able to align with some of the technological information in the book. Now, going back to that picture there, you can see that in the background there's a screen. And in it, there's definitely something going on in there. Now, this screen could also be a window, and I wasn't sure whether at the time I was looking through a window into another part of the craft or whether it was actually something showing on a screen. But I could see this dome, and in the dome there was quite golden a light that didn't emanate out through the exterior of the dome into the room surrounding it. It stayed within that dome, and there were humans in there and greys and foliage. And I asked the entity sitting in front of me there what she could tell me about it. It was a female, and she said that's where you humans go sometimes when you're on a craft for long periods of time. So that indicated to me it was possibly some kind of artificial sunlight. Now you can see the dome, the exterior of the dome there. This is not the only time I've seen these domes. At other times I've seen them in what I call an inactive state, where there's nothing in them or they appear to be empty, and often you're taken into them for a transportation procedure. So they obviously have multiple purposes. She also said that the screen has 5 functions. It can be a wall because they can touch it and it disappears, it just becomes the wall. It can be a window, it can be a communication screen where they're looking at something, a surveillance screen where they're keeping an eye on something, And it can also, the screen is part of a mammoth database, so you can access a database and bring up images, script or whatever on the screen. So it had multi-functions. And so you can see in brackets there's some of our own technology that's come out in more recent years that is very, very similar to what I saw on this craft in 1993. I'll just go back to that one. Now, have you heard of the late Dr. Roger Lear, the American surgeon who took implants out? Yes, some of you have. Okay, I spoke at a conference in Australia and had dinner with Dr. Lear prior to a conference. And while we're sitting there chatting, he proceeded to tell me about a military person who had spoken to him at some stage. He'd interviewed him, who described being taken to a secret base in the States where there was an alien craft sitting on the tarmac, but it was invisible. So it had some kind of technology operating that made it unable to be seen. So he was taken up to the steps leading up into the craft or the ramp by military personnel and assisted to step up. Once he got inside with a group of other people, military people, he was able to see everything inside the craft, and he was able to see out through a window to the tarmac outside. And while he was there, one of the personnel showing them the inside of the craft said that window actually has 5 screens, 5 functions, and proceeded to outline the 5 functions that I was told by the female grey on the craft. Now, Dr. Lear did not know what I was going to speak about the next day. I was going to be describing this. And so it was quite an opportune moment where, again, this corroboration arrives that somebody else has accessed this information too. Now, I heard a noise behind me and turned around. There was a hybrid, what I saw as a hybrid, part human, part grey, coming out of a archway. He had a pile of tablets in his hand. He had, I think I felt him more sooner than I heard him. And by that I mean that we all have an electric field around us. Some people refer to it as the aura. And I could feel this enormous emanation coming from this entity. It was just enveloping me. And he felt extremely powerful, but in a positive sense, extremely intelligent, and it was very daunting because of his extraordinary field around him. And I tried to communicate with him, and he was able to just hold me at bay. So it was like he slowed me down so that you're talking and then you're trying to talk and you can't. So he basically mind controlled me to keep me quiet while he communicated with the other grey seated at the console. And then I asked him a question. I said, "Can you give me some advice for life?" Which was a bit of a random question to ask him, but that's what I asked because I was quite overwhelmed by his presence. And he said to me telepathically, one word that came to me telepathically was corroboration. And that was all. And then he turned and he walked away. And I was quite disappointed at first, thinking, well, what does he mean by that? And what is the relevance? But as the years went by and I began to collect corroboration, I began to realise that for an experiencer, it's probably the most important word in our language, is corroboration. Because people say, oh, how do we know you've been on a craft? You tell these stories. Well, how do we know? Well, one way is that we can corroborate our experiences and what we have seen in the same way that I discovered people who'd seen very specific technology and used it in the same way as me, and we'd never met before. Now, very quickly, just keeping an eye on the time, very quickly going to touch on this. In chapter 32 of my book, Surgery in an Alien Hospital on Board a Craft, which occurred in 1996, one phenomenal piece of technology I want to very briefly talk about before I move on to the second part of the speech. And this involved, I was taken onto a craft. I'd had a car accident, a serious car accident, nearly died. Then I'd had a terrific infection because my immune system had been knocked and I nearly died from that. So I was in a pretty bad way. And I was taken on board the craft, taken into a room with what you might call 2 grey doctors. And there was a big round thing hanging from the ceiling, rather like the operating theatre lights, but without the lights, just like a big disc. And they just touched something, and I could see this shimmering light come down in a distinct, defined column, circular column, come down onto my body. And where it touched my body, say it came around the torso here, I raised my head up onto my elbows and looked, and I could see all my bones. But the rest of my body, from here up, and the legs, perfectly normal. So it's like drawing a circle, and everything within that becomes like an X-ray. So they could change it from the bones to the organs, ligaments, connective tissue, tendons, whatever. They could look at the veins. They could just touch the screen wherever that's controlling it, and up would come a different frequency that showed up something different. Now imagine how phenomenal and helpful that would be. We spend ages under a scanning MRI scan machine that makes a terrible noise just to get images of inside a joint. I had that done recently on my hands because I've got rheumatoid arthritis, and they wanted to see inside the joints. So I had to lie for ages, my hands in the machine, and this was so simple and so clear. And when researching for recent speeches, I found that in November of 2013, companies in the States of Epson and Avena Medical unveiled some smart glasses that allow nurses to see through a patient's skin to the vascular beneath, and that's one of the pictures. So when you put these Google kind of glasses on, special glasses, you can see the veins in a person's arm, because often nurses have a lot of problems trying to find the veins. I know they do on me. They tap and carry on for ages to find it. So we are moving towards this kind of technology, which will be far less invasive. The technology of the future, if it's following the line of some of the stuff that experiencers like myself and others have seen on a craft, we're moving that way. Now, Dr. Shield and I have talked about this at length, and he says, well, either we have downloaded some of the alien technology somewhere along the line, or there have been agreements, meetings between extraterrestrials and humans in the past, and there's been agreements to trade things in some way, and we've gained some technology, or we are simply following the same line of physics. We are slowly advancing in our understanding of new physics, and they're way ahead of us. And we're moving in that direction. And I think I've illustrated that a number of times this morning, how we're slowly moving that way. Okay, let's just briefly move now to some consciousness. Telepathy is a multi-sensory experience on a craft. We think of telepathy as a message going between me and this gentleman here in a striped shirt. He gets the message, but if other people are around, they might get it too. If they're tuned into it, or if they're psychic, or if they're in a relaxed state, they might pick it up. We've all experienced the situation where we think, I must ring my sister. And within a minute or so, the phone rings and it's my sister. We all experience that kind of thing, where we have this knowing of something and then it's said, or it arrives by telephone or whatever. But on the craft, you smell sounds. You hear tastes. It's all turned topsy-turvy. It all becomes a conglomerate, a mass of sensitivities. So you don't just get a message, a telepathic message. It's not like that. You get a telepathic knowing that is enhanced by images they might send you, smells they might send you, emotions they might send you. So you get this holistic picture or holistic feeling of what is being expressed to you. Now, there's different ways that the Greys and some of the other entities I've seen operate telepathically. The first two are quite similar. You'll hear experiencers talking about getting a download. So a big amount of information that might suddenly open up in their mind. And I think, where did that come from? So some experiencers are able to describe scientific concepts or equations that they've never had any experience with at all. Suddenly it opens up, it's there, and they somehow or other use it or express it. Information transfers, you saw before, where the grey was able to put a large amount of information in my mind for me to use. Now, thought seeds is my terminology for it, is slightly different. They might give you a structure. So it's like a teacher might have a lesson plan for what they're going to do with a class, but they can put in their own input and ideas and books, and they might show a video, they might do some artwork or whatever. So a thought seed is something they'll put in your mind that you can then begin to expand on. Multi-layered streams. I've had experiences where they will give you 3 streams of information all at once. When we speak to each other, it's one-to-one. You only hear my voice saying something and this gentleman may reply. So it's one-to-one. But they might send out 3 different streams that explain things on 3 different levels or in 3 different ways, all at the same time. You get it in the head and you have to unjumble it. Telepathic accents. I listen to my husband speak Danish. His parents are Danish. We live in New Zealand, so he's come home to see his family. And but I can hear that his way of speaking Danish is a little different to his cousins here. So we have that accent. You can all recognise a Scotsman when he speaks, right? So different entities and different species, you will pick up a slight difference to their telepathy, and you can define that. And then we have something I call fishing, where if they are trying to explain a concept to you and you don't understand the way they're explaining it, they will just go zooming into your mind and they'll search around, they'll find a terminology that matches or that seems to be right, and then they'll use that, they'll reflect that terminology back to you. They'll say, you would say this, and then you understand what it is that they're expressing. So for example, on one occasion that I pointed out before, where the grey with the galaxy screen was showing me the nuclear explosion, he said, the reason I'm showing you this is, and I didn't understand what he was meant in his next expression, so he went into my mind and he pulled out the expression, it will put fire in your belly, meaning it will make me feel very committed to being anti-nuclear. So he fished for a terminology. Sieving is when they're giving you information and they can see that you're not quite up to speed, you're a little bit slow, and so they throw a whole heap of information at you. And your conscious mind will start registering all this data at high speed, and then it'll get overwhelming and it'll just disappear into the subconscious. And when that point happens, they say, okay, you've got enough information now. And they know that it will rise out of the subconscious at a later date. Multiple telepathic messaging is my terminology for another mode of telepathy on the craft, where a grey may be giving a lecture, and while he's giving the lecture to you all, to the humans, he'll realise that some of you have missed some things, because we all pick up on different things when a person is speaking, and he'll realise you've missed, and at the end, he will accumulate all this in his mind, and at the end of the lecture, he'll just throw it all out. So this gentleman will get what he missed, this lady will get what she missed, that gentleman up there will get what he missed. So everyone leaves with the complete data. And the last one I mentioned before, exclusion. If we're talking to each other and we want to exclude someone, we have to whisper. They are able to just block out a whole section of the audience telepathically. It's like they give you an instruction, you're not going to hear this, and this side will hear it. So this exclusion goes on where they are able to manipulate who hears what. So moving on now to a little experience where I observed a child of 7 being taught some phenomenal mind techniques on the craft. I call chapter 27, Children of the Mind, Using the Brain Like a USB. And this occurred in 1990. So this child was seated on a special chair that had rubber arms, or rubberish arms, something like that, that connected your electric field to the consciousness of the computers on the craft. So he was seated in this chair, arms on these pads. He had a screen behind him, not in front of him. And I thought that was a bit odd. I didn't know why that screen was behind, but I soon found out. Now the grey who was working with him said to him he was going to give him a whole lot of sets of information. Do you know mathematically what I mean by sets? Given a whole heap of boxes, I'll put it that way. You understand what I'm saying? Yes? Sets of information. So this box or this set might have pictures to do with space, okay? And there might be hundreds of pictures in that set. Or it might be that the grey chose flowers, earth-like flowers, and gave the child hundreds of images of flowers, hundreds of images of galaxies, hundreds of images of mountains. But then he instructed the child, you now have to resequence them. So all of the ones that were number 10 and 50 in the sequence, you must put at the beginning. On the set that showed mountains, I want you to put the image that fell at number 66 and number 197 at the beginning, etc. So up the top, we have the grey, who conveys a set of data telepathically to the child. The child reconfigures the sets of data according to the instructions from the grey. And then the child sent that data telepathically to the computer. And then up on the screen came all the sets resequenced. The grey was able to look at them, I was able to look at them, and he was able to check the child had got it right. Now this was a 7-year-old human child being taught phenomenal mind capabilities with telepathy connected to consciousness. But not only that, when the grey conveyed the sets to the child, the grey conveyed them as frequencies. And we've simply put those different colours there to represent frequencies. So he didn't just convey the total images, he conveyed a blueprint. And the child registered all the frequencies. So now we're getting into this other factor that is ever present on a craft, is frequencies and energy. Everything on a craft is to do with frequencies and energy. So the child then conveyed to the computer the frequencies or blueprints. And these were converted by the organic computer to images. Now, that's probably a little complex to understand. So, I say in the book, information is transferred as frequencies, which, like brained minds, can mentally view as imagery. So, unless you, a human on the craft, had been taught to work with these frequencies and energies like this child was, you couldn't do this. So they are taking human children and they are giving them advanced mind techniques, advanced manipulation of data and use of frequencies and energy. And that's just simply showing frequency to image. And Dr. Schultz said, this chapter is for me an amazing corroboration of what I understand as the quantum hologram formulation of information processing in alien technology. And if you want to go home and Google quantum hologram Dr. Edgar Mitchell, You'll find some brilliant material written by Rudy Schild and Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the former US astronaut, on this quantum hologram and how everything is moving towards consciousness. Okay, now we're getting into the soul. C.S. Lewis, the famous writer, said, you don't have a soul, you are a soul. You have a body. Now, some people may not agree with that. Some people may not agree we even have a soul. I don't know. There could be people in the audience. But we are just a body and we have a soul. So let's have a look at what the ETs do with that. Some years ago, I had this memory come to me. It was like a dreamlike memory of myself as a purple ball of light. And I was somewhere with a blue ball of light. And I remembered this quite distinctly. And I remembered that we were, in this dreamlike memory, we were taken before some kind of council, if I can put it that way, a group of intelligent, highly intelligent beings that were somehow or other looking after the spiritual well-being of our planet and the transition of souls into lives on our planet. So there we are, there's these shadowy beings I was in front of. I didn't actually do any communicating because this blue ball that was with me seemed to be doing all the telepathic communicating. And that what was happening was they were outlining a life that I was able to choose. There were 2 lives I could choose, so I refined it down to this one. And then they looked at whether they thought my soul background, everything, all the lives I've lived previously and all the knowledge I've gathered, was that going to be suitable to do this life and carry out some particular job in this life, achieve certain tasks as we all do. And in the end they decided yes, I would be suitable, and I was asked if I accepted the life, and I did, and here I am. Now, moving forward a little bit, using this same concept. Chapter 11 of my book, Meeting the Soul of My Future Son, in 1962, when I was 8. I was taken on a craft and I was asked if I'd like to meet another child. We were in a playroom, what I call a playroom situation, where the carers were male. We would sit around in a circle and we would use consciousness, telepathy to form holograms. You could create a shape and then another kid would put a tunnel through it, all that kind of thing, using the mind to express things and levitating off the floor. There were a lot of mind structures taught to us, and you experienced it by doing it with these other grey and mixed species children. So one of the greys said to me, would I like to meet another child? I said yes. He gave me a great deal of information in 3 streams, like I described before, 3 simultaneous streams. One was, oh, you're going to meet another kid. The next one was a vast amount of information about this other kid, what they were going to do in their life. And then the last one was just smoothing it all over, come with me. So we waited in a room, and eventually 2 greys entered with a blue ball of light floating between them, and I was quite disappointed because I'd assumed it was going to be another child. But I immediately felt like I knew this ball of light. I immediately felt like I loved it, and I started sobbing and crying. And the grey said to me, this will be your son. When you grow up and get married, you will have a child. It will be a son, and this soul will enter that child. This is the soul of the son you will have when you're older. This was quite confusing. I went from feelings of elation to feelings of fear to crying. He kept putting his hand on my forehead just to calm me down. They decided they would leave me for a while to see how I got on with this ball of light. So they left the room, but obviously they were still tapped in telepathically, or maybe could see through the wall to see what was happening. I ended up playing with the ball of light, communicating with it, on a conscious telepathic level. It was able to communicate with me in some way, had some fun. Then they came back in the room, calmed me down and said, good, this will work, this is going to be fine. They said every time you come on the craft, or often, you will relate to this soul and you will get to know it before it becomes your son. So I was taken back to the playroom, and on the way back I said, well, can I tell the other kids? And he said, no, this is just for you, and immediately touched my forehead. All memory of having gone to that room began to fade. Went back into the room and, continued playing with the other kids until it was time to go. Okay, so moving forward again, looking at where this blue ball of light entered my life again. I'm pregnant with my first son in 1983, well, my first child, 1983. Taken on board a craft because I'd been very unwell, and they thought the placenta was failing. They didn't know what effect that would have on the child. And so obviously the Greys were concerned about this as well, took me on the craft to have a look at things. And they said I was going to be fine, and they were now going to do a merging or soul insertion procedure, which once again was very unsettling. I wasn't sure about this, and you can see he's putting his hand over my forehead, calming me down. Explained that he would slow my metabolism. Now, you probably know yogis are able to, people who do yoga are able to slow their metabolism right down, so their body cools, their breathing slows, their heart rate slows. So that's pretty much what he did to me. He slowed everything down and said, this soul has been enhanced by us. So it has had this additions to the soul. It has had learning for the soul and enhancements, which I didn't really understand at that point, but I do now. And so therefore, when it enters the body, it could be a shock to the body if your metabolism was normal. We're going to slow it right down. So just prior to this, they brought the blue ball in. They also brought a whole lot of little grey children, and they told me that these children would accompany him through life. He would learn with them on the craft just as I had learnt with children on the craft, and that they would, they'd be like watchers watching over him throughout life, and he would interact and work with them when he came on the craft as a child. So the metabolism is slowed down, the blue ball of light entered my body and the body of the child, and I felt as if my entire body was infused with light. Eventually I was returned back home, and in the morning when I woke in my bed, I still felt as if I was full of light. And at that stage, once I'd woken up and got up, it began to fade, and I felt quite normal again. So what is this dual soul connection? That's the name of my book, The Dual Soul Connection. What is this dual soul? I can explain it like this. Each of us, in my belief, may not be shared by you, but this is my understanding. Each of us becomes, when we leave this life, becomes a spark in the great field of consciousness. And we may rest there for long periods of time, or we may choose to incarnate again. We may stay in a spirit state. We all know about ghosts and spirit people who are seen, who look just like they did when they were alive, so we may exist in that state for some time, for some reason. But eventually, if we go back to that field of consciousness, as Dr. Rudy Schild calls it, we exist in a little electric state. And eventually, we can choose a life. A tingle will come towards us, as I describe in the book, in the chapter called Soul Origin. This tingle will come towards us, and we'll be given choices of lives. And we'll choose one, and then we'll move towards it. And slowly, we'll take on mass. They now know that the soul has a mass. People weigh differently just after death to sometime after death. They're considerably lighter, so that soul has left. It has electrical density. So we choose a life and we move towards it. But in the case of people who are contacted by some of these extraterrestrial species, they will make an enhancement to the soul. So you'll find yourself on a craft and you will be given extra teaching in the ball of light state before you actually become a human being and are born as a baby. So the soul is taken on board the craft, just like the blue light that you saw in the images there, and it is enhanced. It's given, it's able to access the grey or the extraterrestrial understanding and their use of consciousness and telepathy. So it has this enhanced telepathic ability. Then when the child is born, they are able to access that throughout their life, quite spontaneously. So there are people who will say, I know this and I just know it, I don't know how I know it, and this is why, this is the information I have or whatever. So here we are, the dual soul is the individual soul source that we all are. We've led many lives, we've acquired a great deal of knowledge. When we go into a life, we may only use a portion of that knowledge. We will select what we need for that life or that task. And it's combined there with the grey intelligence or consciousness. And it becomes the human psyche of the person who has these kinds of contact experiences. Now, this doesn't just happen with humans. This is an experimental thing, if I can put it that way. What they're trying to do by introducing this dual soul concept to humanity is they're trying to raise our awareness, because we have become retrograde spiritually. So we are advancing in technology, but the way we use that technology is not always in a good sense. We often use technology to harm each other, to wreck our planet. We're a throwaway society with mounds of junk floating on the oceans, swishing and swilling between one country and another. We've become a dirty planet. Of course, there are places of beauty and places of cleanliness, but in general, we are soiling our planet. And they are deeply concerned about this. They're deeply concerned about what we're doing to other species. And if you think of it this way, are we really necessary on this planet? We consider ourselves the superior species, but are we really necessary? If we were removed or we killed each other off, Mother Earth would keep going quite happily, as would all the other species on the planet. They would live in harmony quite happily. We are not needed. Did we evolve here or were we put here? I don't know. But if we have a position of guardianship on the planet, we're not making a very good job of it. And so this is what they are doing with these deep, multi-leveled programs that they're doing with humans, taking people on board craft, thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. There's probably people sitting in this audience who've experienced it. Educating us, giving us jobs to do, and elevating consciousness across the planet. We are in a stagnant state. We are in the muddy water. If you look at a clean flowing river, it's clean in the channel in the middle where the river is fast flowing. But on the edges, it's muddy and there's bits of rubbish floating. There's not much life there, it's stagnant. That's where we are in terms of our development. So this is an attempt by the extraterrestrials to elevate our awareness, our understanding and our maturity, because what are we doing at present? We are going out into space. But we haven't changed. We're a warlike race, and we are wanting to go to Mars and sending probes out beyond. If you were living out there, would you be rather afraid of us coming out there? I would be. So we have to go through a long and sincere process of change. And people say, well, why don't they come and land on the White House lawn? Because we're not ready for that, that's why. People say, why can't we have disclosure tomorrow? Because we're not ready. the UFO community worldwide might think that they are. But we are a tiny population within the world population. Other people are not ready for this. So this whole dual soul thing happens between their species. It's been going on between other species for a long time. And I have seen an entity transitioning between a grey form and a mantis form. When he was about to do some healing, he was drawing on both of those, the knowledge from both of those species, and he allowed me to see his form transitioning so that I could understand that he too was accessing two species. And when I was, my husband drew this picture, he actually drew a male in the bed, but it's actually supposed to be me. And when I was 14, I had the experience of finding 3 greys by my bed saying, "Get up, get up." And there was a moment of confusion because I wasn't sure who was supposed to get up. Was I, Susie, supposed to get up? Or was this other intelligence within me supposed to get up? And the human body slept and the grey intelligence rose in a ghost-like form. Now, there's many experiencers around the world who talk about this duality, who talk about going on a craft and walking out of their human body as a grey. It's very difficult to get your head around that or even accept it when you've experienced it yourself. But that is what experiencers and abductees worldwide are reporting. Now, in my research, I have talked for several months now to a wonderful man in the States who is 81, and he's been a researcher for a long time. And he worked very closely with Dr. John Mack from Harvard University, looking at experiencers' dialogues. And he contacted me recently because he said, look, when I was doing regressions with people and working with them with Dr. Mack, we came across this dual reference. We didn't understand what it was. So I sent him a copy of my book and he said, now I believe I understand what this dual reference is that people were referring to. So there's this dual soul. We have a soul combined with the grey intelligence, able to access. Dual reference, where people talk about walking out of the body on the craft as a grey or some other species. And then you have people who talk about past life, a past life as an ET. There's lots of people doing past life regressions and finding they've led a life as some other species. And then there are people, a lot of the what labelled the star children, and they are talking about their memories. They remember being something else, and they brought that memory to this life as a human. This is Joe Nyman, who I've been talking about, former UFO field researcher, a lovely man. And he said he produced a paper in 1995 at a conference in the States. And he said, in this paper, I report the discovery of an even more profound set of images that causes the abductee to completely reorient their perspectives of the nature of these experiences. I call these perspective-altering images dual reference, the experiencing of oneself as both human and alien at the same time. So what he's saying is that often in regression, people will be quite shocked because one moment they're talking as a person and the next they're saying, but I've actually just stepped out of my body and I'm now a grey. And he calls this kind of experience perspective altering because a lot of people who have regressions are having them because they have bad memories. They have very negative memories of contact, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes if they have a regression, they have this perspective altering situation where they realise that they actually have got access to this other intelligence and it wasn't so bad after all. And he says it implies the taking up of residence in the human form at birth or before, which is what I described, of a fully developed intelligence which is both human and non-human in nature, and of the prearranged monitoring to be conducted throughout life. So the Greys are monitoring these humans who have this dual soul perspective and who have tasks to do with raising awareness and understanding of this field. And Dr. Mack also stated, roughly half of my recent cases have revealed a relationship to the beings which is similar to Joe Nyman's dual reference. The dual identity appears to be a fundamental dimension of the consciousness expansion or opening that is an intrinsic aspect of the abduction phenomenon itself. Now I'm going to put something to you. We talk about disclosure and eventually having open contact with ETs. And we don't know how we're going to react, how many sectors in society are going to react badly to that. But how would we react if by the time this happens, we came to the understanding that many of the hybrids on a craft are related to us, have been created with some of our genes, are our relations? And how would we feel if we realised that many humans are related genetically to Greys? That would somehow make us step back and assess the situation. Would we then react in a negative sense? I don't know. We may find out. Now, just getting towards the end of the speech now, I've put this in here because I have talked about the 3 waves agenda, which I speak at length about in my book, Volunteer Souls to Planet Earth. And I recently had someone write to me and say, you have copied an American researcher called Dolores Cannon, who wrote a book of that name. No, I have not. In Sydney, Australia, in June 2007, there's me there, presenting the 3 waves agenda. Dolores Cannon visited Sydney shortly after that, heard about my presentation. When I went to Laughlin in 2010, she was selling her book of the name, The 3 Waves Agenda, The Volunteer Souls to Planet Earth. So the point I'm making is, I said it first. Okay, so what's the 3 waves agenda? Quickly going through this. If you want to buy the book, you can read about it at length and decide if you fit into any of these. The first wave, in this agenda that the ETs have been doing in conjunction, from my perspective, with the spiritual hierarchy of our planet, that oversees the souls coming in and incarnating here for various reasons. There's the first wave. Now, the first wave are innovators and enlighteners. And the first wave, the innovators, actually started around 1800 and something. So this has been going on for a long time, moving us slowly forward. What I call the enlighteners in this first wave are what some of you may know as the Star Kids, the Crystal Kids, the Indigo Children, etc., who come with memories of past lives and previous lives as ETs, come with all sorts of psychic abilities, and all they're doing really is showing us that these other things are possible, that we can do these other things. We are intuitive beings. We are psychic beings. We are telepathic beings. We just don't always want to own those labels. We don't want to go there. So many people don't want to know about that whole other side of us. The second wave, which is what I belong to, is by far the biggest wave. And lots of people in the second wave are around about in their late 40s right through to their 80s. Big, huge area of incarnation. And these people are communicators. They are the ones who are going to start opening up to their experiences. They're going to start remembering their experiences on board craft. If you go back to the 70s, when I first started realising I was having these experiences as an adult, lots of people were coming out as abductees. You had a number of books being written worldwide. It was a new subject. People didn't know whether to loathe it or love it or be scared of it or whatever. Nobody really wanted to own up to having these kinds of experiences. Some people have just completely forgotten or glossed over the experiences. Some people, the ETs have made you forget the experiences, and they will wake you up sometime soon, because we are now in the time of the awakening, and there's going to be a great big graph that goes up like this as we start to gain spiritual understanding, using it in conjunction with technology to help each other. New forms of medicine, new forms of education, new forms of transport, right across the board, it's going to change. But for that to happen, we have to change first. So the second wave are what I call the communicators. And many of them have this dual soul perspective, and they are being monitored and guided through life. The third wave is my son's group. And you'll read all about my son in my book. And many of these third wavers have dual souls, and they are going to be the ones who make changes. So he is now in his early 30s, and people in this third wave, many of them are children of people like myself. They are going to make changes across the board. They've been taught the kind of skills that I showed you that 7-year-old had. And when they start remembering and utilising those skills, because they've been kept under wraps and concealed by the ETs to keep them safe, because we all know that there's a lot of surveillance that goes on these days. I have had terrific surveillance in New Zealand as a sightings person, a researcher, and as speaking about contact experiences. I've had my house broken into, I've had a 1.5 years of anonymous phone calls, I've had threats, I was taken aside by CIA agents in the States, I was threatened and told, you go home and you never talk about this again because you've got 2 sons, haven't you? And you wouldn't want something to happen to them, would you? So this is a kind of manipulation. I've had my house watched, things tampered with. So it happens, and it can be very difficult keeping going under those circumstances and making sure your family are happy with you keeping going. So these third wave ones who are now around about, some still being born right through to, say, late 30s. They will eventually start remembering their experiences and utilising their skills. They will be in all kinds of positions, in professions, but all sorts of other kinds of positions right across the board. And they will use their telepathic skills and their understanding of energy and frequency and ecology and in the environment. They will use it in a positive sense, and they will all end up in positions where they can make change in a positive sense. And once they get started, you're going to really see things start improving on the planet. So there's the image that I put up, just showing you how they've incarnated in different time frames. That's described in the book. Okay. Here we have, again, are they going to be our relatives? I was, in 2001, on a craft, I was taken to a room where there were all these little babies. And I'd been into lots of rooms with hybrid babies over the years, but these ones were different. These ones were the offspring of these third wave humans, hybrid offspring, raised on the craft. And they had something very strange about their skin on their ankles and wrists, where it was in folds, almost like as they grew, it would stretch out and fit properly. I distinctly remember that. And the other thing was the eyes. You may know the abalone shell or the opal stone, where if you tilt them, you get different colours showing up in sheets, changes colour. Well, their eyes were distinct. They were green and blue, like what we in New Zealand call a paua shell, which is a small abalone. So this is what we've got happening on the planet at the moment. We've got superstorms. We have got, some say global warming, some say climate change. There's a whole array of opinions on that and debates going on and storms raging in different areas of science. Is it real? Is it not? But I think we can all agree that we're still getting earth changes, and they're getting more severe in nature. Now, just finishing off, I was taken on one occasion with a whole lot of other humans that you can see there, in a grandstand situation like this, in an underground base, and guess what? There were humans in the chain of command. This was not military, this was something else. This was some separate group, and they were working with the Greys. And this was in 1987. And they predicted a time in the future when there would be widespread chaos, what they described as a dead stage on the planet. The human psyche will experience global despondency during this period, and people will be at a loss to know where to go, even physically or geographically, or where to turn for assistance and guidance. Now, is that not the situation we've got now? Is that not the situation that's been going on for several years, but suddenly we look at the refugees surging up from Syria, we're becoming borderless, people don't know where to go, there's chaos in society, there's chaos politically, there's chaos in the big corporations, there's financial chaos. Something has to give and change. We can't keep going like this, we'll hit rock bottom. In my book I say communicators, that's people in the group that I'm in, are being activated quickly now worldwide. So people are waking up to their experiences. And when more of them start communicating their experiences and understanding of extraterrestrial contact themselves through a variety of means, it will facilitate an unlocking process in people who as yet have little or no conscious memory of why they incarnated in this life. How many people do you know who are just riding through life and have no idea why they're here and don't do anything positive? How the communicators present their knowledge and experiences to the public will be crucial. This ongoing process of triggering human consciousness is part of our expansion of awareness, a microcosmic reflection of our expanded universe. So people are waking up in all areas, waking up to themselves, to each other, to spirituality, to telepathy, to the potential that lies in the future. And Dr. Schuld, in my book, stated, I consider Susie's last statement to be profoundly correct. Consciousness enhances the VZPE, or vacuum zero-point energy, dark energy, and assists the accelerating expansion of our universe. Thus, we, as sentient beings, are co-creators of the universe. Everything we do, everything we think, everything we create for our future helps to create the universe, and we need to examine what kind of universe we wish to live in. Thank you.